They tried to erase his name because names have power, and once you hear this one, you won't sleep the same. What you're about to hear was never meant to survive. Not in ink, not in memory, and definitely not in you. There is a reason certain histories rot in silence. Not because they are false, but because they work. Because they reveal what happens when a system designed to break men accidentally forges something far more dangerous than rebellion. This is not a story about freedom. It's a story about consequence. About what pain manufactures when cruelty is applied with precision, year after year, without witnesses who matter. In the low country of South Carolina, where rice plantations ran like machines fueled by human bodies, power depended on predictability. Every lash, every ration, every rule was engineered to condition obedience. Enslavement was not just physical captivity, it was psychological architecture. Strip identity, fragment family, reward silence, punish memory, and above all, ensure that no single man ever believes he can say no. But systems fail when they encounter men who learn instead of break. Between 1822 and 1824, something moved through the plantations near Georgetown like a pressure crack beneath the surface of ice. Overseers began refusing assignments. Injuries appeared without explanation. Tools went missing. Guards reported the feeling of being watch-tracked not by mobs, but by intention. And at the center of every whisper was a man whose existence could not be officially confirmed, because acknowledging him would mean admitting failure. The records don't name him. That wasn't an oversight. It was strategy. Plantations kept meticulous accounts: bushels, births, deaths, punishments, because control requires documentation. Yet this man appears only in margins, coded language, and a single private journal entry written by a local magistrate decades later. One line, no embellishment, just terror dressed as prayer. We have created something we cannot control. This matters to you because the mechanisms that made him still exist. They have only evolved. Pain is still applied methodically. Identity is still fragmented. Resistance is still isolated and labeled dangerous. And men are still taught to internalize suffering until it either kills them or sharpens them. This story is about the moment that sharpening began. Not with violence, but with observation. With silence. With a man realizing that if he was already considered property, then fear was the only leverage left to take back. Once you understand how that realization forms, you'll recognize it everywhere. And once you recognize it, there's no unseeing it. He arrived the way all dangerous truths do, quietly, disguised as routine. Coffle from Charleston. 17 bodies. Chains clinking like punctuation marks at the end of someone else's sentence. By the standards of 1819, nothing about that morning was unusual. And that was the first mistake. The man they renamed Samuel stepped onto Fair Haven Plantation carrying more history than the ledgers could hold. 6 feet tall. Broad shoulders shaped by iron, not soil. Hands marked by precision, labor calluses formed by control, not chaos. He had been a blacksmith once, which meant he understood force, leverage, heat, and timing. For things overseers never bothered to study. He had also been sold 5 times in 7 years. That detail mattered. Men weren't resold that often unless something went wrong. Tools break. Animalsti. But men were expected to adapt, to submit, to disappear into the rhythm of the field. Samuel never did. Every previous owner recorded incidents, a vague word plantation culture used to avoid admitting fear. Broken locks. Injuries blamed on accidents. Dogs refusing commands. Nothing provable. Nothing that survived into formal accusation. So they erased patterns instead. Fair Haven was not a place that tolerated deviation. Marcus Hewitt built his fortune on efficiency and punishment refined into art. He didn't just own people, he engineered them. The task system measured output with mathematical cruelty, pushing bodies to exhaustion while preserving the illusion of mercy. Finish your task and you earned time. Fail and the lash corrected your thinking. This is how institutions teach obedience. They reframe suffering as choice. Samuel saw it immediately. He watched how Overseer Drummond walked the land not randomly, but in loops. He noticed who spoke for authority when authority wasn't present. He listened to the cadence of punishments, the way fear was spaced out to remain effective. Most men only saw survival. Samuel studied structure. And then there was Clara, pregnant, weakening, already marked for future loss. The system counted her as a depreciating asset, not a life. Their 2 children were already gone, sold away like excess inventory, their names removed from proximity so memory itself would rot. That is how power kills resistance, by isolating pain until it feels personal instead of political. But pain accumulates. Samuel did not rage. He did not plead. He did not perform despair for the overseer's satisfaction. He did something far more dangerous. He waited. He learned. And he began calculating how much fear one man could generate if he stopped asking to be spared and started deciding what he was willing to destroy. This is where monsters are actually born, not in madness, but in clarity. The breaking point never announces itself. It arrives disguised as policy, as routine, as just the way things are done. On Fairhaven, it came on a Monday morning when the heat was already pressing down like a hand on the back of the neck, reminding every man in the field exactly where he stood in the order of things. Clara collapsed face first into the mud. No drama. No escrime. Just gravity finally winning. Her body, starved and overworked, simply refused another command. The other workers froze, not out of indifference, but training. On plantations, reaction itself was regulated. Move too fast and you invited suspicion. Move too slow and you invited punishment. They hovered in that narrow space where humanity barely survived. When Overseer Drummond arrived, he did not see a woman. He saw a disrupted workflow. His eyes measured time, labor, loss. Get her to the sick house, he said, like issuing instructions for a broken plow. Then he turned to Samuel and delivered the sentence meant to restore balance. You will finish her task on top of your own, or you will both pay for it tomorrow. This is how domination sustains itself, by forcing impossible choices and then punishing whichever one you make. Samuel stood still. That silence mattered. It broke expectation. For 3 seconds, nothing moved except the insects buzzing over the waterlogged fields. Other workers stepped back instinctively. They recognized something Drummond didn't. The posture of a man who had already crossed a line internally. When Samuel spoke, his voice was level, almost respectful. No, that single word was treason in a system that survived on reflexive obedience. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't emotional. It was controlled. And control is the one thing power cannot tolerate in the hands of the enslaved. Drummond threatened him because that was the script. Samuel agreed because fear no longer worked. Then he did something that exposed the machinery behind the cruelty. He reframed the situation not as a moral plea, but as an economic one. Beat me if you want, he said. Kill me if you choose. But you will get no more labor, and the owner will want to know why his assets stopped producing. This was psychological warfare, not rebellion leverage. Drummond hesitated, not out of mercy but calculation. In that pause, something irreversible happened. A system designed to enforce compliance had been forced to negotiate. Word spread instantly, not because Samuel defied an overseer, but because he won. That night, men in the quarters whispered a new possibility. Not freedom, not uprising, something quieter and more dangerous. The idea that the system could be made to bend if you understood what it actually feared. And systems always fear exposure. For 7 days, the plantation watched a man attempt the impossible. Samuel rose before dawn and entered the fields already bleeding from yesterday. He completed his own task with mechanical precision, then crossed into Clara's section and began again. 12 hours became 16. 16 became 18. Pain stopped being a signal and became background noise. This is the point most people misunderstand. What Samuel was doing wasn't endurance. It was demonstration. Every finished row exposed a lie at the heart of the system that output was limited by ability rather than by control. And when other enslaved men and women began drifting toward him during stolen moments, offering minutes of labor disguised as rest, something far more dangerous than defiance emerged. Coordination. No words. No planning meetings. Just mutual recognition. The overseers didn't notice at first, because domination trains its enforcers to look for noise, not patterns. But Drummond noticed. And when authority notices patterns forming without permission, it responds with spectacle. Torches, whips, public lesson. Samuel was stripped not to punish his body, but to remind everyone else of theirs. Each scar on his back was a record of previous compliance. Drummond spoke about place, about mercy, about who decides when suffering ends. Then the lash fell. Samuel did not cry out. That silence was the real rupture. Pain without submission confuses power. It destabilizes the ritual. Every overseer understood that whippings were not just punishment, they were theater. And Samuel refused to perform. This is where the transformation accelerated. Because when pain no longer produces obedience, systems escalate. And escalation always reveals intent. Before we go further, I need you to mark this moment. Not for me, for you. Comment the phrase, "I see the pattern" twice. Once for the algorithm. Once to signal that you understand this story isn't about the past. It's about how power still responds when men stop reacting and start observing. After that night, Fairhaven changed. Overseers avoided Samuel's path. Guards doubled. Punishments elsewhere became harsher, compensatory. The system was tightening not because it was strong, but because it felt exposed. And exposure is the one thing institutions cannot survive intact. What followed was not rebellion. There were no weapons raised, no fires set, no slogans whispered. That's why it worked. Between 1822 and 1824, incidents began appearing in plantation reports across 3 counties. 17 officially recorded. 43 injuries with no cause assigned. A man falling from a watch platform where no one saw him pushed. Dogs refusing to track. Locks jammed from the inside. Rice stores spoiled overnight. Nothing dramatic enough to prosecute. Everything disruptive enough to erode authority. This is how pressure is applied by men who understand systems. Not through confrontation, but through attrition. Samuel became a ghost with intention. He was seen everywhere and nowhere. Always working. Always compliant on paper. And yet, the plantation began hemorrhaging control. Overseers complained of unease, of the sense that rules no longer produced predictable outcomes. Fear, once neatly distributed, began pooling in the wrong places. Owners hate uncertainty more than loss. The Magistrate's Journal would later record a single admission. We cannot isolate the source. That line should haunt you, because isolation is how domination survives. When pain is individualized, resistance dies privately. Samuel reversed that equation without speeches, without banners, by proving that one man's clarity could reorganize fear itself. The final mistake came when they tried to erase him. His name disappeared from ledgers. His tasks were recorded as completed by various hands. Injuries were logged without attribution. The belief was simple. If they removed recognition, they would remove influence. They were wrong. Erasure does not eliminate threat. It mythologizes it. Stories traveled faster than documents ever could. From quarters to kitchens, from plantations to docks. A man who could not be broken because he no longer expected mercy. A man who understood that once you accept the worst outcome, power loses its primary weapon. This is the moment he stopped being a person and became a principle. By the time Fairhaven's owners realized what they had created, it was already too late to undo. Control systems cannot be quietly repaired once their logic is exposed. They can only be reinforced or abandoned. And reinforcement always carries a cost. Overseers refused assignments near Georgetown. Too many accidents. Too much tension. Productivity dipped. Insurance rates climbed. The very efficiency Hewitt prided himself on began to rot from the inside. And Samuel? He remained unpunished. Not because he was forgiven, but because touching him now carried consequences no one could fully calculate. This is the paradox of domination. Excessive cruelty eventually breeds men who are no longer governable by fear. Samuel was never freed. There is no redemption arc here. No triumphant escape. That's intentional. Because the truth is more disturbing. He survived inside the system long enough to alter its behavior. And then he vanished, either sold quietly, killed without record, or absorbed into the silence he had learned to weaponize. But his effect lingered. For decades, overseers told new hires stories about a man whose name they couldn't say. A warning disguised as folklore. A reminder that some men do not break the way systems expect them to. That some learn faster than pain can teach. This matters because modern control works the same way through documentation, incentives, isolation, and fear of loss. And it still fails when men stop seeking relief and start seeking understanding. Samuel's pain didn't create a monster. It created clarity. And clarity is what institutions fear most, because it cannot be negotiated with, intimidated, or erased. Once a man understands the pattern, he doesn't need permission to step outside it. And neither do you. Long after Samuel vanished from record, the system that tried to erase him quietly rewrote its own rules. That is how you know the story is real. Power never reforms out of conscience. It reforms out of fear. Plantation correspondence from the late 1820s shows subtle changes, longer rotation cycles for overseers, stricter compartmentalization between work groups, harsher penalties for unauthorized cooperation. None of this was attributed to a single cause. It never is. Institutions learn to disguise lessons as policy updates. But beneath the language of efficiency was a single objective: prevent another man from seeing the whole machine at once. Because that was Samuel's real crime. He didn't strike back blindly. He mapped the system in his mind. He learned where authority actually lived, not in whips, but in predictability. In the assumption that men would always choose survival over meaning. That pain would always produce submission. And once that assumption failed, everything built on top of it began to wobble. Here is the part that should unsettle you. Samuel did not need allies who knew his plan. He only needed men and women who recognized truth when they saw it enacted. His resistance worked because it required no ideology, only awareness. Small acts correctly placed at the right pressure points. A delayed response here. A missing tool there. Just enough disruption to remind the overseers that obedience was no longer automatic. Modern systems operate the same way. They do not require your loyalty. Only your predictability, your debt cycles, your attention loops, your fear of falling out of line. And just like Fairhaven, they panic when a man stops reacting emotionally and starts behaving strategically. This is why certain histories are framed as cautionary tales instead of case studies. You're taught to see enslaved resistance as emotional, desperate, irrational, never calculated. Because calculation invites imitation. And imitation is what power cannot tolerate. Samuel's legacy was not freedom. It was something more dangerous to control systems. Precedent. Once men know that fear can be inverted, that pain can be rendered non-compliant, that silence can be weaponized, the architecture of domination begins to leak. Slowly, invisibly, but permanently. The question is not whether Samuel was real. The question is how many men like him exist now, undocumented, unnamed, quietly testing the limits of systems that assume you will never see them clearly. There is a reason this story stayed buried. Not because it was too violent, but because it was too instructive. If Samuel had led an uprising, the lesson would be simple: crush rebellion early. If he had escaped, the lesson would be containment. If he had been publicly executed, the lesson would be fear. But he did none of those things. He stayed. He endured. And he altered behavior without ever announcing himself as a threat. That is the kind of knowledge that changes men. Because once you understand that control depends on your participation, not your consent, you begin to see how often you are trained to comply with systems that quietly extract from you while calling it normal life. You begin to notice how rules are enforced selectively, how incentives replace chains, how surveillance replaces overseers, how identity is fragmented so no one ever feels responsible for the whole. Samuel learned this under conditions most men could not survive. You are being given the pattern without the chains. That carries responsibility. Dangerous knowledge is not about anger. It's about clarity, about understanding where power actually operates and refusing to exhaust yourself fighting illusions. Samuel never tried to overthrow Fairhaven. He made it unstable. He forced it to adapt around him. And in doing so, he proved a truth institutions still try to suppress. Systems reveal their weakness the moment they have to change their own rules to contain one man. You were not told this story in school because it does not produce obedience. It produces discernment. And discernment is incompatible with mass control. Remember how this began. A name erased. Pattern denied. A fear documented only in private journals. That is always how the most effective resistance appears, not as a headline, but as an anomaly no one can explain away. If the story unsettled you, it should have. Not because of the past, but because of the present. Because once you recognize the architecture of control, you cannot unknow it. And once you cannot unknow it, you face the same choice Samuel did. React emotionally and be managed. Or observe patiently and become unpredictable. They fear the second man far more than the first. And now that you've seen the pattern, the descent is complete.